A scorched secret lies where memories smoulder and justice waits beneath the dust. Dear listeners, welcome to the channel The Wimsey Casebook. This is Morgan Finch speaking. Always curious, where are you joining us from? Settle. This is The Ashes Beneath the Hearthstone by Dorothy L. Lord Peter Wimsey was not, strictly speaking, expected at Shrivelling Minster. Nor for that matter was the fire expected to uncover human remains, though one supposes that such occurrences do rather tend to attract him. The trouble began with an aga, a bottle of cooking sherry, and an ambitious Yorkshire pudding. All three conspired, as local legend would later have it, to cause a sudden conflagration in the west wing of the Broxley Rectory, a charming, if slightly oppressive, Georgian vicarage where lace doilies clung to the arms of chairs like dying spiders, and the air smelt faintly of boiled mutton. The fire brigade, summoned with alarming slowness by Mrs. Verity the cook, arrived just in time to preserve the main structure and enough silverware to keep the insurance claim tedious. It was only 2 days later, after the ashen beams had been carted away and the local mason sent to assess the hearthstone's damage, that the odd little discovery was made. A blackened femur, then another, then a scrap of charred linen. The hearthstone had long been cracked, and underneath its flag lay a neat and shallow cavity filled with remnants no archaeologist would claim. Canon Broxley, a red-faced gentleman of advanced girth and nervous digestion, took one look and nearly collapsed into his tea. The remains, he insisted, once revived by the robust application of smelling salts and Eccles cake, must be ancient, a Civil War victim, perhaps, or a Roman slave. Quite the historical find, he muttered, with a trembling hand over his gout-swollen knee. Should go to the museum, I dare say. Unfortunately, the constable who arrived, young P.C. Felix Price, newly transferred from Devonshire and possessing a deeply inconvenient degree of curiosity, was not so inclined. He peered down at the bones, rubbed the black soot thoughtfully between his fingers, and asked whether the canon knew anyone who had gone missing recently. "Only my sermon notes," the canon replied weakly. It was the parish clerk, a wiry, sharp-nosed man by the name of Dabble, who first spoke of the woman. "There was that governess, sir, Miss Hartley. Went off without a word last Lent. Funny thing, she left her slippers." From that moment, things developed with the inexorable inevitability of a minor scandal. The remains were collected and boxed. A coroner was summoned, though not before Mrs. Verity, having taken an aversion to all bone-in meats, swore never again to serve oxtail. The hearthstone was marked with white chalk, and the local press had the audacity to suggest it bore the impression of a woman's face in agony, though this was, upon closer inspection, a lump of soot clinging stubbornly to the edge. Enter Lord Peter Death Breeden Wimsey. He arrived not on account of the bones, but owing to a misdirected invitation. Lady Broxley, second wife of the canon and daughter of a baronet, famous for his obsession with German Lieder, had mistaken a letter from the Oxford Poetry Circle for one from the Archaeological Society, and thus invited Wimsey to speak on the lyricism of dust. Being in need of an excuse to avoid his aunt's musical evening in Basingstoke, which promised a soprano's interpretation of Wagner's lesser-known Cats, Wimsey had accepted with more alacrity than sense. "Bones under the hearth," he remarked cheerfully, stepping down from the Lagonda and handing his gloves to a startled boy in oversized boots. "Well, well, I do hope they kept them alphabetically." He was met by a hush of disapproval and the distinctive smell of scorched pine. The vicarage lawn was still streaked with fire-hose mud, and a police tent squatted on the flower beds like a very large, very sullen toad. Inside, the mood was not improved. The canon, now confined to his wing-back chair and a diet of warm milk, greeted Wimsey with a nervous wheeze. "I do apologize, my lord. I fear there's been a dreadful misunderstanding." "Don't we all misunderstand one another now and then?" said Wimsey, inspecting the edges of the room with that idle gaze which always gave the impression he was spotting a leak in the ceiling or a concealed compartment. "Besides, one never minds a mystery provided there's tea." P.C. Price, who had been stationed in the adjoining room with a cup of lukewarm coffee and the sort of pen that leaks in one's pocket, introduced himself with awkward formality. "We're not quite sure what we've found, Lord Wimsey. The coroner says they're human remains, female but badly charred. Forensics is still working out whether there's enough to determine cause of death." "And the hearth?" Wimsey asked, already drifting toward the west wing as if by instinct. It had cracked slightly during the fire, and the stone lifted when they cleared out the soot. "Found the cavity just beneath, sealed in on all sides but the top, like a box. I suppose, or a coffin," murmured Wimsey, "though one hopes without the velvet lining. Curious choice for interment. Cold feet, no doubt." He walked the perimeter of the ruined parlour, stepping lightly as though afraid to disturb the ghosts of furniture long since hauled away. "And Miss Hartley, governess to the children 3 years ago, left suddenly last spring, said to be romantic disappointment, though she left her belongings behind. And no one thought it worth mentioning until now." She was quiet. Nobody really knew her. Came from Lancashire, no family anyone could trace. Temporary post, and she wasn't particularly warm. "Excellent," Wimsey said with relish. "Those are always the best, governesses with secrets. Like governesses with keys, or governesses who knit things with code in the pattern." He turned back to the room and crouched, elegantly if eccentrically, beside the chalk-marked stone. "May I?" P.C. Price hesitated, but the canon, too stupefied to resist, made a vague gesture of approval. Wimsey brushed aside the covering, tarpaulin, and examined the edge of the stone. A hairline crack ran along one side. The faintest smell of scorched fabric clung to the earth beneath. "Stone's not original," he murmured. "This is Portland, not local. Laid maybe 20 years ago. Odd choice for a vicarage fireplace, far too grand. Someone wanted this exact size, this exact fit." Price frowned. "Why?" "Oh, no reason," said Wimsey lightly. "Unless one were very interested in what one was burying." He stood and brushed the dust from his cuffs with absurd delicacy. "Tell me, Constable, has anyone asked why the fire started?" "Faulty wiring, they think. Kitchen appliance. Though Mrs. Verity insists it was her Yorkshire pudding, she's taken to cursing the eggs." "Then, perhaps," said Wimsey, pausing, "in the doorway, we ought to ask whether Miss Hartley was fond of puddings or fire." He did not wait for a reply, but instead wandered off down the hall with the unhurried step of a man walking to a library in search of a misplaced quotation, leaving behind the faint scent of sandalwood and suspicion. It was characteristic of Lord Peter Wimsey that upon learning of a potential murder concealed beneath ecclesiastical flooring, his first order of business was not interrogation, but an inspection of the vicarage's drawing-room wallpaper. "This pattern," he declared to Lady Broxley, who stood supervising tea with a face composed of equal parts social obligation and existential fatigue, "is known as Cranford Blue, designed in 1907, frightfully popular in vicarages with aesthetic ambitions. But do you notice, dear lady, how it fails to match at the seam behind the escritoire?" Lady Broxley, who had spent the morning re-embroidering cushion covers to calm her nerves, blinked. "I suppose it might. That paper's been up since my husband's first wife was alive. I never quite liked it. Nor one suspects, did she?" Wimsey murmured, pressing a finger to the misaligned seam. "People often express dissatisfaction with patterns when what they really mean is people." "I beg your pardon?" "Nothing at all. Merely that unhappy marriages have a way of showing up in the wallpaper eventually." If Lady Broxley considered this an unorthodox comment from a man invited to lecture on lyric poetry, she had the good sense not to say so. Instead, she gestured toward the parlour, where a selection of locally made Battenberg and a rather listless sponge cake had been arranged with the quiet desperation of a woman atoning for an inferno. "Do you take sugar, Lord Wimsey?" "2. And no lemon unless you wish me to quote Keats." With tea in hand, Wimsey turned his attention to the household staff. It was the second footman, hired more for symmetry than utility, who led him discreetly toward the servants' quarters, where Mrs. Verity was holding court with a gravy-stained apron and an expression of theological despair. "Yorkshire pudding," she said for the third time that morning, "has never betrayed me before." "No doubt it repents," said Wimsey, sinking onto a low stool and ignoring the look of horror this prompted. "Tell me, Mrs. Verity, Miss Hartley, what sort of governess was she?" Mrs. Verity sniffed. "Thin sort, pale, always carrying a book like she wanted to hit someone with it. Never said more than a thank you or a good morning, and even then like it hurt her. Literary preferences? Didn't ask, but she left a copy of something awful on her bed. The Turn of the Screw. Gave me nightmares." Said Wimsey. "There's something refreshingly honest about women who prefer ghosts to men." He turned to the housemaid, Elsie, a girl of indeterminate age and a complexion that had seen more bleach than sunshine. "And you, Elsie? Did she strike you as the sort who might bury things?" Elsie looked faintly panicked. "Only. In books, sir, I think she was frightened." "Of what?" "Everything. Especially?" Elsie hesitated. "The cellar. She never went down there." "Did she say why?" "No, sir, but I heard her once, talking to herself in the corridor. Said something about footsteps at night, and a scrape like a shovel." "Aha," Wimsey said, not quite smiling. "Ghosts and shovels, a promising combination." Before further inquiries could be made, the butler, who bore the improbable name of Mortlock, appeared at the kitchen door, bearing himself with the solemnity of a funeral procession. "My lord," he intoned, "a message has come for you. Scotland Yard Inspector Parker is en route." "Splendid," Wimsey exclaimed. "One always feels better when Parker arrives, like the cavalry, only with better grammar." He rose, brushing imaginary dust from his knees. "Mrs. Verity, I thank you for the pudding, explosive though it was. Elsie, should you hear any further whispers from the departed, do send word. They seldom lie." With the arrival of Inspector Charles Parker came an increase in procedural solemnity and the faint smell of tobacco. Parker, lean-faced and always slightly underdressed for the countryside, entered the drawing-room with the expression of a man whose train had been delayed and whose dinner was now uncertain. "Peter," he said without preamble, "I'm told you found yourself in a ghost story." "Rather," Wimsey replied, "though I suspect it's less ghost and more governess. You've heard the tale?" "Bits of it. Remains in the hearth. Unidentified female. Cannon swooning over scones." Wimsey nodded. "Miss Hartley. Vanished. Last Lent. Left her slippers and an eerie impression. The remains are hers, or likely so. There's a timeline to be reconstructed if you're keen." "Always." They began in the study, which was lined with leather-bound theological texts and the faint scent of camphor. Parker laid out a modest file, statements from the canon, Mrs. Verity, the maid, and Dabble the clerk. "What strikes you?" Parker asked. "That no one really remembers her," Wimsey said thoughtfully. "It's a peculiar thing, Charles. How one can live in a house and still not exist in it. She left no quarrels, no romance, no dramatic departure. Just vanished, like an apology no one quite heard. And yet she was buried under the hearth." "Indeed, which suggests the apology came too late." Wimsey turned a page. "What's this? Dabble mentions a visitor, 2 days before she vanished. A man, mid-40s, dark coat, said he was a cousin, no name given. Do we believe that? I believe Miss Hartley believed it. She asked for the day off. Took the train to Lower Trimbrook. Returned that evening. Pale, shaken, and according to Elsie, smelling of smoke. Smoke? Indeed, not pipe smoke. Bonfire. Wood ash. Parker leaned back. So she met someone. Perhaps the cousin. Perhaps not. Perhaps it was blackmail. Perhaps she discovered something herself. Precisely. What I want, Charles, is a full account of the day she returned. Who saw her? What did she do? And where exactly was the canon that night? Parker lifted an eyebrow. You suspect the canon? I suspect silence, Wimsey replied. And when silence occurs in a house so full of sermons, one must ask which verse has been omitted. It was at this moment that Mortlock reappeared. Begging your pardon, my lord, he said, but there's a gentleman in the hallway who insists on seeing you. Does he insist politely? Said he has information regarding Miss Hartley. Refuses to speak to anyone but the toff with the monocle. His words, my lord. Ah, said Wimsey, standing. The monocle beckons. He adjusted his tie, smoothed his lapels, and offered Parker a grin that might have belonged to a man stepping on stage. Let's go meet the ghost's emissary, shall we? The man waiting in the tiled hallway of the Broxley Rectory was not what one might have expected of a ghost's emissary. He was of middling height and middling appearance, the sort of person who might vanish entirely in a crowd or a church pew. His hair was neatly parted, his moustache trimmed with military precision, and his overcoat carried the unmistakable aroma of old cigarettes and cheap cologne. He stood straight as a lamppost, his hat clutched in front of him like a shield, and his gaze was fixed firmly on the umbrella stand, as if he feared it might strike first. Lord Peter approached him with the same light, feline interest he might have afforded a rare chess piece in a curiously muddied game. I'm the toff with the monocle, he announced cheerfully, though I do also respond to Lord Peter Wimsey if you're feeling more traditional. The man gave a stiff nod. Mr. Alfred Tinniswood, he said, voice clipped, of Market Ganister, builder, domestic improvements. I heard about the incident. Thought you ought to know I saw her. You refer presumably to Miss Hartley. I saw her that day. Day she vanished. Been a year, but I remember it. Wimsey ushered him gently into the drawing-room, where Parker was already laying out a notepad and inspecting the angle of a nearby chair with the distracted frown of a man who suspects upholstery of treachery. Do sit, Wimsey encouraged. And please do not feel the need to filter anything for our tender ears. We've both been to boarding school. Tinniswood sat down with the air of a man accepting his fate. It were the Monday, he began. Early March, bit damp. I was doing some work for old Mrs. Eden, west side of the village, chipped lintel, bit of brick pointing. She's got a narrow drive, and I had to back the van in close. That's when I saw her. Miss Hartley, walking down the lane. Didn't look at me. Pale as chalk, walking fast. Alone? Asked Parker. No, that's the bit. She weren't alone. There was a man with her. Broad fellow, maybe 10 years older. Long coat, brown with a belt. Looked like army surplus. He was talking, fast. She weren't saying a word, just kept walking. Wimsey leaned back in his chair. And you're sure it was her? Oh, yes. She tutored my sister's lad, little Robbie. Always had a straight back like she was carrying books even when she weren't. This were her. Parker took over. Did you see where they went? They turned into the woods, right past the chapel ruins. There's an old path leads down to the quarry road. Quarry? Aye. Been shut for years. But there's a hut. Old keeper's place still stands. Folks say tramps use it sometimes. Or worse. Worse? Wimsey echoed. Tinniswood hesitated. They say you can hear. Things at night, scraping, crying, that kind of talk. Never saw it myself, but you know how places get reputations. Wimsey steepled his fingers. And did Miss Hartley return the same way? Not that I saw, but I weren't watching all day. Just saw them go. Parker looked up. You said nothing at the time? Didn't think it mattered. She left, they said, took a train out. I figured maybe she ran off with him. And you're saying this now. Why? Tinniswood's fingers gripped his hat brim tightly. Because now they're saying she's dead, and I saw her alive. I thought you should know. Wimsey tilted his head slightly. Well, Mr. Tinniswood, thank you. You've been most helpful. After the man had gone, and the umbrella stand, left unmolested, Parker rose. You think he's telling the truth? Oh, undoubtedly, Wimsey said. He was too careful not to embellish. And he remembered that overcoat. People never forget wartime fashion. It's practically a badge of trauma. So we've got a man, possibly military, seen with the victim the day she vanished. That puts him high on our list. Wimsey gazed out the window at the still charred garden. It does, but I should like to know more about that quarry. Why? Because if you wanted a quiet place to have a confrontation, that would do nicely, especially if you had a history to bury. Parker jotted something down. And you think the killer took her there, then brought her back here just to hide the body under a fireplace? Wimsey tapped his temple. I think that someone wanted her both forgotten and symbolically confined. A governess under the hearth. There's something chillingly domestic about that, as though she were a family secret meant to be trampled on daily but never spoken of. That's poetic. I try. They left the rectory shortly before dusk, choosing to walk the old path to the quarry on foot. The woods thickened quickly beyond the chapel ruins, where brambles had clawed through, the stonework like ivy with a vendetta. The path narrowed into something less like a lane and more like a memory. But Wimsey pressed forward with the determined curiosity of a man searching for an obscure footnote in a particularly dusty library volume. Here, Parker said, stopping as a clearing opened ahead. That must be the hut. The old quarry-keeper's lodge stood slanted under the trees, its roof missing a corner and its door hanging askew like a drunkard's coat. Wimsey pushed it open and stepped inside. Dust, rot, and old smoke. The air was sour with mildew, but beneath it, something sharper. Burnt cloth. Wax. The remains of a candle stub sat in a rusted tin, and on the floor, partly hidden by debris, lay a scarf. Grey wool with a faint floral print. Miss Hartley's? Parker asked. Wimsey lifted it with care. I rather think so. The colour's consistent with what the maid described. A soft sound made them both freeze. A creak, then the crunch, of gravel outside. Parker turned sharply, but Wimsey raised a hand, only a squirrel scampering across the roof. But the tension lingered. Peter, Parker said quietly, if she was killed here, there might still be traces. Blood. A weapon. Wimsey nodded. Indeed. But I suspect this was not the site of violence. It was a meeting place. Perhaps she came here willingly, and something went wrong later. She may have returned to the vicarage, perhaps confronted someone. The canon, the first wife's family. We must check the canon's whereabouts that night, and Lady Broxley's. I don't like what the maid said about footsteps and shovels. Parker sighed. And so we're back to secrets. Wimsey smiled faintly. Weren't we always? As they left the clearing, the moon broke through the trees, casting pale shadows across the path. The scarf fluttered once in Wimsey's hand, like something reluctantly exhumed, and behind them the broken hut sat silently, keeping its secrets for now. Back at the Broxley rectory, dusk had deepened into a thick, purplish hush, the kind that muffled sounds and exaggerated silhouettes. Somewhere down the hall a clock struck 6 with a lugubrious clang, as though in mourning for something not yet spoken aloud. Lord Peter Wimsey returned from the quarry with his usual air of detached amusement, but Parker, who had known him long, enough to detect the difference between whimsy and suspicion, could see it in the subtle tightening of the jaw, the extra beat between questions. They reconvened in the drawing-room. Lady Broxley had retreated to the music-room where she was reportedly coaxing melancholy hymns from a German harmonium. The canon, having been fortified with barley water and ecclesiastical indifference, was dozing behind a copy of Church Times with his slippers precariously balanced on a crocheted footstool. "Did you notice," Wimsey said conversationally, "that the scarf in the hut bore the faintest scent of verbena?" Parker, still shaking damp leaves from his coat, raised an eyebrow. "I'm afraid my olfactory memory isn't as cultivated as yours." "It's the little things, Charles," Wimsey replied. "A scent, a book title, a pair of slippers left behind. People don't vanish neatly, they scatter breadcrumbs. It's just a question of who's meant to follow them, and who's meant to see them at all," Parker added. Wimsey gestured toward the hallway. "Let's have another word with Elsie, shall we? I believe she's seen more than she understands. Maids always do, but unlike detectives, they're never encouraged to connect the dots." They found Elsie polishing the brass stair rods with the furious energy of someone avoiding thought. She stood as they approached, hands trembling faintly despite the tin of Brasso. "Sit down, Elsie," Wimsey said gently. "We're not here to blame you for anything. We'd like to understand what you might remember." Elsie sat on the lower step and wiped her palms on her apron. Her eyes were large, uncertain. "I said before she was frightened, sir. That's true. But there's more." "Go on," Parker encouraged. "It was the night before she vanished. I was putting linen away. I heard voices in the hall, not arguing exactly, but tight, like when people are trying not to be heard." "Who was speaking?" Elsie hesitated. "Miss Hartley and Lady Broxley." Wimsey's brows lifted, but he remained silent. She said something like, "I didn't come here to be threatened," and Lady Broxley said, "You came here to disappear. Don't forget that." Then it went quiet. "I think she saw me near the stairs. She turned away fast." Parker scribbled notes. "You're quite sure of the wording?" "Yes, sir." "And you didn't tell anyone?" Elsie flushed. "I didn't want trouble, and Miss Hartley was gone the next day. I thought maybe it was about her wages or something private." "Quite," Wimsey murmured. "Everything is private until someone ends up under a hearthstone." He rose and turned to Parker. "I think, Charles, it is time we spoke to Lady Broxley properly." They found her in the music-room, seated with spine perfectly erect before the harmonium, her fingers resting on the keys like a pianist awaiting execution. She did not rise as they entered, but merely turned her head with the weary grace of a woman who had been dreading precisely this conversation. "Lady Broxley," Wimsey began, "I trust you won't consider it improper if we ask you to revisit your acquaintance with Miss Hartley." "I never had an acquaintance with Miss Hartley," she said coldly. "She was employed by my husband. I saw her at meals and heard her walking about at night. And on the night before her disappearance." Lady Broxley's lips thinned. "I remember no particular conversation. Elsie, the housemaid, recalls overhearing one." Lady Broxley's hands tensed over the keys. "Then Elsie is mistaken." "Perhaps. But let us suppose for the sake of civility that she is not. What might you have meant, Lady Broxley, when you told Miss Hartley she came here to disappear?" A long pause. "She had secrets," Lady Broxley said finally. "You must understand we did not hire her directly. She came through an agency, one with a reputation for taking on delicate cases. Young women of quality but no means, often with unfortunate pasts. She was discreet, reserved, and she kept to herself. I made inquiries after she left. There were inconsistencies in her paperwork. I found no birth record for her under that name." Parker leaned forward. You think she was using an alias? I believe she was someone running from something, or someone. Wimsey studied her carefully. That's rather a leap, if all she did was read Gothic novels and go pale when she passed. A cellar door. There was more, Lady Broxley said. Letters came from London, hand-delivered, no stamp, once a week for 3 weeks. After each one she looked worse. Did you intercept one? I opened the last. I felt it was my duty. I feared she might harm herself, or the children. And it was a single page. It said, "You cannot bury the past under floorboards forever. It always breathes." Wimsey gave a low whistle. A bit heavy-handed for blackmail, don't you think? Lady Broxley said nothing. Did you keep it? I burned it. Of course. He stood and offered her a slight bow. Thank you, Lady Broxley. Should you remember anything else, perhaps a particular scent or phrase or the colour of an old coat, please do not hesitate to summon us. As they stepped back into the hallway, Parker said quietly, "She's hiding something." Obviously, Wimsey murmured. But not, I think, the murder. Lady Broxley is concealing a past encounter, possibly something shameful. But I don't believe she struck Miss Hartley or set that hearth. She's too clean. Her guilt is the guilt of silence, not blood. Then who? That, said Wimsey, pausing before the study door, is the question. But let us remember, we've heard about one visitor to Miss Hartley. There may have been another. He opened the door to the study where the canon still slept, oblivious to the dust stirring beneath his hearthstone. The following morning dawned with that particular sort of bleakness, found only in English villages where every chimney pot seems to exhale disapproval. The mist lay like lace over the grass, draped in folds around the gravestones in the churchyard, and softening the shapes of the trees until they resembled mourners in shawls. Lord Peter Wimsey appeared at breakfast in the rectory dining room, dressed in a tweed that suggested a leisurely weekend of trout fishing, though he spent most of it turning the cream jug around in thoughtful circles. Across from him, Inspector Parker nursed a tepid cup of tea and stared at the half-eaten kipper on his plate, with the kind of skepticism usually reserved for unreliable witnesses. "No eggs," the canon had announced with vague regret, his mouth disappearing into the buttered edge of toast. "Mrs. Verity is convinced the chickens have gone on strike. Symbolic, perhaps. Rebellious poultry, the world turns upside down." Wimsey murmured something about revolutionary hens and returned to the matter at hand. "The timeline, Charles," he said after the canon had retreated to the study to reread a sermon on the Book of Job. "We must break it." Parker blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Snap it clean in two," Wimsey said, now peering intently at the vicarage grandfather clock. Miss Hartley was last seen alive on a Monday afternoon, walking toward the woods with a man in a military coat. Supposedly she returned that same evening, but we have only the word of silence to confirm that. She was seen by no one. Wimsey shook his head. Elsie thought she heard her voice. Mrs. Verity believes she heard her upstairs. But both of those could be ghosts, impressions. People hear what they expect to hear. No one saw her. No one spoke to her directly. And the canon? Claims to have gone to visit a sick parishioner in Leaden Row. No one has confirmed the visit. Parker sighed. "We're dealing in vapours, Peter. Memories faded, evidence burned, the victim without a name." Wimsey stood abruptly. "Then, we must visit Leaden Row. The sick parishioner in question is a Mr. Greenfield, retired carpenter, devoted reader of the Illustrated London News, and prone to bouts of gout. If he was bedridden, he will remember who brought him ginger biscuits." They set out by motor car, the Lagonda cutting a civilized swathe through the country lanes. Leaden Row lay nestled between two unambitious hills, and Mr. Greenfield's cottage proved to be a neat affair with a slate roof, a spotless garden gate, and a suspiciously symmetrical set of rose bushes. Mr. Greenfield greeted them with an expression of mild alarm. possibly owing to the sudden appearance of a monocled aristocrat and a Scotland Yard inspector on his porch. Canon Broxley? The man said once the purpose of their visit was delicately broached. Oh yes, did visit me, but not the Monday, no. That would have been the Wednesday. Remember it well, because my son came the day before and brought me that new brand. Salve ointment, smelled like a chemist's drawer. You're certain? Parker asked. Certain as pews on Sunday. Wimsey offered the man a tin of tobacco in thanks and returned to the Lagonda with the expression of someone who has found the last missing semicolon in a Greek manuscript. So the canon lied, Parker said. Or forgot, Wimsey countered. But either way, he was not absent the night Miss Hartley may or may not have returned. Back at the rectory, Wimsey requested access to Miss Hartley's belongings, which had apparently been stored in the attic since her disappearance. Mortlock led them up a narrow set of stairs to a dust-laden chamber filled with the sad detritus. Of clerical life, old choir robes, a trunk of hymnals, a broken prie-dieu. In the far corner stood a modest trunk, marked with the initials M.H. Wimsey knelt beside it and began to lift the items one by one. A plain grey cardigan, a set of hairbrushes, a cracked mirror, 3 worn books, Jane Eyre, Villette, and a pocket edition of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, and at the bottom a velvet pouch tied with green ribbon. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single silver locket, the sort sold in drapers' shops for 6pence, but its contents were not sentimental. Instead of a photograph, it held a tightly folded square of newsprint. Wimsey smoothed it out on a nearby crate. The headline read, "Tragedy in Paddington Flat. Woman found dead in suspicious circumstances." The article described the death of a young woman aged 29, name withheld pending notification, foul play suspected, one suspect questioned, released due to lack of evidence. Parker read over his shoulder. There's no date. No. But there is a line, Wimsey said, pointing to the final paragraph. The incident occurred just before the Whitsun holiday. That places it in late May or early June. I'll wager the year was 1932. I remember that case. It made a brief stir. The woman's name was never released. Miss Hartley could have been connected. She could have been the witness or the suspect or the victim's sister, but whatever the link, she carried it with her here. She changed her name and came to Broxley to disappear, just as Lady Broxley said. Parker exhaled. So she was hiding. But someone found her. More than that, Wimsey said softly. Someone wanted to remind her that she hadn't vanished entirely, that she could still be unearthed. They returned the trunk to the attic and stood for a moment on the landing, staring down the shadowed corridor. Charles, Wimsey said suddenly, do you know what strikes me as odd? Only a few dozen things. No one mentioned the dog. The what? The rectory dog. Surely a household this old had a terrier or spaniel, something small and eager to bark at disturbances. Yet we've heard no mention of one. No yapping during the fire, no sadness in the canon's tone, nothing. Parker frowned. Perhaps it died. Old age, poison, accident. Wimsey nodded slowly. Yes, but when? And where is it buried? They descended in silence, the question trailing behind them like the echo of a dropped spade. As they reached the front hall, Mortlock emerged with a scrap of paper in his hand. This was found behind the escritoire, my lord. Lady Broxley said it. Was likely detritus, but I thought it odd. Wimsey took the page. It was torn from a notebook with jagged edges and smudged ink. 3 lines were scrawled on it in a feminine hand. I hear it still at night. The footsteps. The door. I should have told someone. Wimsey stared at it for a long moment. She tried, he said finally, in her way, but the question remains, what door? And somewhere behind that door, a truth waited with breath held and matches ready. The door in question was not metaphorical, as Lord Peter Wimsey had initially mused, but quite literal and singularly well concealed. They found it later that same day, just after luncheon, when Parker, restless and stooping to pick up a dropped cufflink from the rectory corridor, noticed a faint draught issuing from the oak-panelled wall outside the former schoolroom. The panelling was old, darkened by generations of smoke and polish, and one strip bore a narrow vertical crack just wide enough to suggest tampering. Wimsey, summoned with the urgency typically reserved for buried treasure or the discovery of a rare Mallory manuscript, examined the anomaly with the air of a man greeting an old acquaintance. "Ah," he murmured, tapping the panel lightly. "We are now entering that most beloved phase of detection, the architectural curiosity." With a flick of his fingernail along the skirting, a slim catch gave way. The panel shifted with a reluctant creak, revealing a shallow cavity, and beyond it, a low door made of ancient wood and fitted with a small brass handle, dull to the color of forgotten secrets. The passage beyond smelled of lime, candle soot, and undisturbed time. A narrow flight of stone steps led downward into darkness. Parker fetched a torch. Servants' passage? Wimsey nodded. Or more interestingly, something predating servants altogether. Monastic tunnels, perhaps. Or, more deliciously, escape. Routes for recusants during the Reformation. I always find English Christianity is never happier than when it's hiding in cellars. The passage ended in a tight-angled bend, and after 20 feet or so, they emerged into a small brick chamber with arched ceilings and a flagstone floor. Shelves lined the walls, most empty save for a few rusted tins, a chipped teacup, and an abandoned shoe. But it was the object in the center of the room that drew their attention. A chair, wooden, high-backed, with a strip of knotted cord looped around one leg. Wimsey approached it slowly. "She came down here," he said, "not once, but many times. I think this was her refuge." Parker eyed the walls. "Or her prison." Wimsey picked up the teacup, sniffed it. "Earl Grey. Not long abandoned by the smell of it. She brought comforts, came here by choice. This was not a cell, it was a hiding place, and from what?" "That," Wimsey murmured, "is what we must still unearth." They searched the chamber, discovering nothing but dust, spiderwebs, and a faded ledger book filled with Victorian inventories for the rectory's wine cellar. Later, back in the canon study, where the canon himself was preoccupied with a distressing passage in Ezekiel, Wimsey returned to his notes. The timeline had begun to fracture, yes, but now it twisted. Miss Hartley, they were beginning to understand, had not merely been hiding from her past. She had been living two lives at once. The rectory's demure and taciturn governess had also been the frequent nighttime occupant of a forgotten chamber beneath the house, a room known only to a vanished generation and herself. What was she doing there? "I believe," Wimsey said aloud, "that Miss Hartley was writing." Parker looked up. "Writing what?" "That," Wimsey said, "is the next question." They returned to the attic and examined the trunk more closely. Within the lining, behind the velvet pouch and beneath the false bottom, Wimsey found a sheaf of pages carefully wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it like a relic, lifting the contents into the grey light filtering through the attic window. The handwriting was Miss Hartley's, precise and elegant. The title at the top read, "The Woman in the Bell Tower, a Tale in 3 Acts." Parker skimmed the first page. "A play? Possibly autobiographical," Wimsey murmured, already reading. It was a narrative told in veiled phrases and allegorical scenes, a young woman hiding in a vicarage, visited at night by a ghostly figure in uniform who accuses her of betrayal. There were dialogues about graves, about guilt, and about a child that had never been named. The details are symbolic, Wimsey noted, but the emotional content is not. She wrote this to exercise something, perhaps to warn someone. Or confess, Parker suggested. Wimsey tapped the paper. There's a line here. The hearth must hold what the heart cannot. That's not allegory, that's a message. And this man in the uniform? The same one seen by Tinniswood. A real visitor, I think. Someone from her past who tracked her down. Someone with power over her. They took the manuscript to the drawing room and laid it out across the table. Lady Broxley appeared at the doorway, pale but composed. You found her writings, she said. You knew. I suspected. There were evenings when she would vanish for hours and return looking soot-smeared and anxious. I thought it was madness. But it was something worse. She was being haunted, Wimsey said quietly. Not by ghosts, but by memory. Lady Broxley sat. There was a man, he came twice, not by the front door. The first time she spoke with him on the grounds. The second, he entered the house. I saw them, from the upper window. They argued in the hall. He grabbed her arm. She was terrified. Why didn't you report it? I was afraid. She was afraid. And when she vanished, I believed she'd gone with him. Parker scribbled furiously. We need a name. I never heard one. But he had an accent. Educated but northern. And he carried a cane, though he didn't limp. Wimsey's expression sharpened. A cane? Yes. Wimsey turned abruptly to the canon's bookshelf and ran a finger along the titles until he found a dusty volume on clerical correspondence. He flipped to a page, then nodded. Here it is, a letter addressed to Canon Broxley dated 3 years ago, from a Reverend Alton Birch, Lancashire Diocese. Brief, polite, inquiring after a possible vacancy for a former seminary student wishing to remain incognito due to unfortunate complications. And the canon wrote back denying the request but acknowledged knowing the student in question, one Mr. Felix Barstow. Parker froze. Barstow? Wimsey nodded. He was the suspect in the Paddington case, the man released for lack of evidence, the one Miss Hartley feared. Parker stood. So he followed her here? Yes. Perhaps he had something over her, a past affair, a joint crime, or knowledge of her real identity. Perhaps she witnessed the Paddington death and he silenced her. But why hide the body under the hearth? Because it was symbolic, Wimsey said grimly. He wanted to entomb her beneath her refuge, turn her sanctuary into her grave. That's why the hearthstone was new. He prepared it. Parker exhaled. And the fire. Either accident or a belated attempt to destroy what was buried. Lady Broxley's voice was low. You think he came back? I think, Wimsey said, that he never truly left. Outside, the mist had risen again, curling around the chimneys like questioning fingers. In the parlour, the manuscript lay spread open, its final page yet to be turned. It was past 9 o'clock when Lord Peter Wimsey and Inspector Parker stepped once again into the West Wing parlour, that scorched and skeletal room whose cracked hearthstone had become the axial point of their investigation. The shadows inside were long and ragged, thrown by the flicker of a gas lantern placed atop a stack of hymnals. The place bore the hush of a sanctified ruin, half chapel, half crime. Parker crossed the floor with deliberate care. If Barstow killed her and buried her here, Peter, then came back to cover it with fire. Where did he stay? Someone must have seen him. Wimsey knelt beside the hearth again, running a gloved finger along the rim of the stone. Or no one. Saw him because he never truly left. Parker turned. You still think he was here, living in the house? Living near it, Wimsey said softly. Or passing through it. There are nooks in these country rectories you could hide half the Royal Society in if you stacked them properly. He stood and turned toward the window, where the moonlight silvered the broken panes. Besides, there's something not quite right about the way that fire started. Mrs. Verity blamed the Yorkshire pudding, yes, but note the timing. The fire began the very week the hearth was due for repairs. Coincidence or cover? Parker frowned. You think he was trying to erase the evidence? Or panic set in, the body was decomposing. There was moisture in the floor, perhaps the smell returned. Barstow might have thought fire the swiftest erasure. Wimsey glanced toward the door. I shall require a spade, Charles. Parker blinked. A spade? Yes, and not for metaphorical digging for once. There's something about the earth near the hearth. It was turned too recently to be merely scorched. I want to see how deep it goes. Half an hour later, with Mortlock's hesitant assistance and the canon tucked safely away with a glass of barley wine and the Psalms of David, they lifted the hearthstone again and began to dig, slowly, carefully, layer by layer. The soil had indeed been disturbed, but not just once. There were signs of a second interment. About 2 feet down, the spade struck something hollow. Wimsey dropped to his knees. Hold the lantern, Charles. He pulled away the loosened soil to reveal the decayed remains of a wooden box, charred at the edges, warped by time and heat. He pried open the lid with a flat-bladed knife. Inside lay not bones, but books, dozens of them. Journals, diaries, some with spines intact, others eaten through by mold. Wimsey lifted one and opened it with reverence. The first page bore the name Mary Hartley. The second, Volume 4, October 1931, March 1932. Parker leaned in. Her diaries. Wimsey nodded. She wasn't just writing stories, Charles. She was documenting everything, every meeting, every fear, every sound in the night. He turned a few pages. Here, March 12th. He came again. I saw him in the orchard at dusk. He carries the cane still, the one with the brass tip. He knocked twice at the scullery door, and I did not answer. I do not think he will wait long. Parker exhaled. This confirms it. Barstow was here. She feared him. Enough to write it. Down. To bury the record. Wimsey continued reading. I tried to speak to the canon, but he changed the subject, said he did not believe in ghosts. He does not understand that some men are more frightening than spirits. He closed the diary gently and replaced it in the box. There's our motive, he said, and our method, but not yet our man. Parker stood. So, where do we look next? Wimsey turned toward the doorway. The village. We ask if anyone has seen a man with a cane lately, an outsider, someone who looks like he belongs but doesn't quite, and we re-interview Tinniswood. The builder? Yes. He gave us just enough to be plausible, but not enough to be believed. I think he saw more than he told us. They found Tinniswood at the local pub, the Saint and Badger, sipping a pint and watching a dart match with studied disinterest. He rose quickly as they approached. Lord Wimsey, Inspector, something new. Several things, Wimsey said pleasantly, but I'd like to revisit that walk you saw Miss Hartley take, with the man in the long coat. Tinniswood shifted. I told you everything I remembered. Did you? Wimsey smiled faintly. Because I've now spoken to 2 other villagers who say they saw someone matching that description entering the vicarage the next morning. Not the same day, the morning after. Do you still wish to stand by your version? Tinniswood looked cornered. I didn't want to get involved. He scared me. Who? He said his name was Mr. Birch, that he was an uncle. But I didn't believe him. Too nervous. Kept looking over his shoulder. Asked where the old chapel path went. I told him, but then he said something odd. What? Tinniswood swallowed. He said, she used to sing in the attic. I don't know what it meant, but it gave me a chill. Wimsey's eyes narrowed. She didn't sing. No one ever said she sang. Parker leaned forward. Tinniswood, you're withholding something. A long silence followed. Then he had the cane. The one with the brass tip, Wimsey asked. Tinniswood nodded. He leaned on it like a habit, not a need. And when he left the house after Miss Hartley was gone, he was smiling, the kind of smile you don't forget. They returned to the rectory at midnight, the wind rising behind them like a breath withheld too long. Inside, Wimsey returned. To the manuscript, the final pages now stained with soot and time. He turned to the last line. "When the bell tolls in the chapel ruins, he will come again. And someone must be waiting." Wimsey stood. "Charles," he said quietly, "we lay a trap. The ruins. Tomorrow night, we make the past walk out of the dark. And far beneath their feet, in the soil still cooling from old embers, the last twisted. Detail shifted into place. It was a theatrical sort of dusk the next evening, one of those elaborate affairs that seems arranged by some cosmic dramatist with a flair for symbolism. A thick mass of clouds curtained the sky like stage drapes, parting occasionally to reveal bruised streaks of vermilion. As the sun bled westward, a single bell tolled from the crumbling chapel ruins just outside Broxley, its sound muffled and spectral, as though echoing from beneath the earth rather than above it. Lord Peter Wimsey adjusted his collar and peered across the moss-draped stones with a kind of morbid cheer. "Only the best scenery for our little performance, Charles," he murmured to Inspector Parker, who stood nearby with his overcoat buttoned to the throat and his expression grim. "I still think this is dangerously thin ice," Parker replied. "What if he doesn't show?" "He will," said Wimsey, voice light but unflinching. "He's a creature of ritual. This place, this time, it means something to him. He buried her within earshot of this chapel. He quoted bells. He wants to believe he's in a story of his own making, and people who think they're authors of destiny can seldom resist a well-staged conclusion." They had arranged it carefully. The rector's bell had been temporarily reattached with enough rope to be pulled from below. Young Constable Price, whose youthful eagerness had not yet been curdled by experience, stood hidden behind a buttress. With a watch and a revolver that had once belonged to his grandfather, Lady Broxley reluctantly but resolutely had agreed to play the final role. She stood now at the mouth of the chapel, a heavy cloak around her shoulders and Miss Hartley's diary clasped to her chest. She would be the bait, not to lure him romantically. Barstow, if it was indeed he, was not driven by desire, but by fear. She would hold the thing he thought destroyed. Proof. Witness. Wimsey glanced at his watch. 2 minutes. They waited. An owl hooted. Somewhere a branch cracked. Then footsteps. Soft, uneven, deliberate. A shape moved among the gravestones. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark coat with a turned-up collar. He carried a walking cane. Wimsey's breath did not quicken, but his hand dipped into his coat pocket, closing around the reassuring weight of his pocket revolver, a relic of more dangerous days. The man paused at the arch of the chapel, gaze fixed on Lady Broxley. "You rang the bell," he said, his voice low and cultured, with that unmistakable northern precision. "Why?" "I think you know," Lady Broxley replied, lifting the diary. He took a step forward. "That was supposed to be gone. It wasn't. She wrote it. She hid it. And now we've read it." He smiled faintly. "And what does it say?" "That you came back." A pause. "And if I did?" "You killed her." A longer silence. "I didn't mean to," the man said. Lady Broxley's grip on the diary faltered slightly. "Then tell me what happened." He stepped into the nave, his face half-shadowed, half-illuminated by the pale gleam of the overcast moon. "She betrayed me," he said simply. "She promised she would keep quiet. After London, after the flat, I let her walk away. I gave her the name, the money. And then I heard she'd spoken to someone. A letter. I couldn't risk it. So you followed her. Yes, and I tried to convince her, but she was different. She had found peace, I think. Or thought she had." She wouldn't run again, so I stayed, waited. I found a way in. The boy, the builder, saw me once. I watched from the trees. She kept her routine. She wrote every night, in that little room under the stairs. She thought no one knew, but I knew. And the night you killed her? He looked past her, into the ruins. It was quiet. She was coming back from the cellar. I confronted her in the hallway. She screamed. I didn't mean to hit her that hard, but she fell. Her head struck the iron fireguard. And after that, he glanced at the chapel wall, now visibly trembling. I panicked. I knew the canon would return soon. I remembered the fireplace. The stone was loose. I had seen it. I dug. I buried her. I fitted the hearth over it myself. I had been a carpenter before, long ago, and then I left. You came back, he nodded. Months later, I thought the house empty, but it wasn't, so I waited again, watched again, and then I smelled it. The rot. I knew the fire would spread fast if I set it right, so I baked my bread and left the pudding in. Wimsey stepped forward at last. A poetic touch, he said, dryly. The perfect domestic death. Barstow, if it was Barstow, turned, startled, and saw the others stepping from the shadows. Parker. Price. 2 local constables. The cane dropped from his hand with a soft thud. He did not resist arrest, nor did he speak again that evening. He walked between Parker and Price as though entering a courtroom he had already sentenced himself from. Later, in the rectory's smoking room, Lady Broxley stood at the hearth and looked down at the floor. We're right, she said to Wimsey. He couldn't leave it behind. No, Wimsey replied. Men like that need the stage, even for their confessions. And what will happen to the canon? He'll recover, eventually. He was not a bad man, only a forgetful one. And the church has always preferred its ghosts remain metaphorical. She gave a sad, wan smile. And Miss Hartley? Wimsey lifted a cup of brandy. Will be remembered, properly this time. The vicarage is being exorcised, in the literary sense. We'll see to it her name is restored. Outside, the wind was rising again, swirling leaves and whispers around. The stone ruins. The bell rope had been removed, but something, wind memory, seemed to echo its toll in the air. Parker sat down beside Wimsey. You didn't explain, he said, how you knew. The detail that clinched it. Wimsey tapped his temple. The dog. The missing one? Yes. No one had seen it. But in Miss Hartley's diary, she mentions it daily, always curled. Beside her chair in the hidden room, and then silence. The day after Barstow came, it was gone. I realized then it must have barked, and he couldn't have that. Parker closed his notebook. That's why he set the fire. No, Charles. That's why he killed her. The fire was just the encore, and somewhere in the depths of memory and manuscript, the last bell tolled. It was 3 days after the arrest when the hearthstone was finally sealed again. Wimsey stood over it, coat collar turned up against the chill, as 2 masons from Catterfield and Sons reset the rectangular slab of Portland stone with precise, mournful movements. The scent of lime mortar hung in the air, blending oddly with the lingering trace of scorched varnish from the west wing fire. The rectory was quiet, unnaturally so. The canon had retreated to a cousin's house in Malvern. Lady Broxley, though outwardly composed, had taken to long walks alone through the orchards. Even Mrs. Verity no longer spoke of puddings. The stone gave a dull thud as it dropped into place, level, final. Parker, watching from the doorway, remarked softly, "It's strange. We've uncovered the crime, named the killer, brought justice, and yet it doesn't feel like triumph." "It rarely does," Wimsey replied. "Solving a murder is much like repairing a leak in the roof. Satisfying, but somehow always damp." Afterward, the masons packed their tools. Wimsey gave a small nod of thanks and crossed the room, placing one hand briefly upon the stone. "She's beneath here no longer," he said. They'll bury her properly, you know, name and all." "Have they identified her real name?" Parker asked. Wimsey withdrew a folded sheet of paper from his breast pocket. "She was Margaret Elaine Hartley, born 1903, Paddington, London. Her sister was the woman in the flat, the one who died in 1932. Police suspected a jealous lover, Barstow, but the case fell apart. Margaret disappeared soon after, changed her name, vanished into the employment agencies, and here she was." Parker read the paper in silence. So it wasn't just guilt that followed her. It was grief. Wimsey nodded. "Barstow found her again, perhaps by accident, perhaps by design, but I think—" He paused. "I think she tried to fight it, in her way. She wrote, she recorded. She didn't scream in the street or throw herself on the mercy of the cannon. She used her words." Parker shook his head. "We almost missed it. If the fire hadn't cracked the stone, if the pudding hadn't risen so violently," Wimsey quipped, "we'd never have found the bones or the diaries. The puddings of Yorkshire strike again." Parker allowed himself a half-smile. They walked through the vicarage together, past the now-abandoned schoolroom, through the echoing vestibule where a crooked umbrella stand still bore the scratches of age and accident. At the foot of the staircase, Mortlock appeared. "A telegram for you, my lord," he said, offering the cream-coloured envelope with a solemnity more befitting a last will and testament. Wimsey opened it with a fingernail. He scanned the contents, then handed it to Parker. "From the Home Office," he said. Barstow confessed in full. Not just to Miss Hartley, but to the earlier death. The sister in Paddington poisoned, arsenic in the wine. The diaries rattled him more than I expected. Parker read the final line. "Please accept our gratitude for the resolution of both matters. The Ministry is considering appropriate commendation." He handed it back. "You're collecting commendations now?" "I'll keep them next to the rare bookplates," Wimsey said, tucking the telegram into his coat. "I find civil appreciation always pairs nicely with 18th-century printing." Outside, the wind had picked up. The trees leaned like eavesdroppers against the sky. The chapel ruins, visible through the bare-limbed orchard, stood dark and skeletal, as if resentful that their spectral reputation had been so rudely interrupted by mortal violence. "I wonder," Parker said as they paused on the front steps, "what it was that finally broke Barstow. The diary? The setting? The woman standing there with the words he thought burned?" "All of it," Wimsey replied. "Men like him thrive on invisibility, on being half a step behind you in the mirror. We made him visible." He turned his face to the wind. "And we gave her finally someone who listened, one who—" They walked slowly down the rectory path, past the withered rose bushes, the broken trellis, the cold beds where daffodils would bloom come spring. The earth seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the freeze to end. At the gate, Lady Broxley was waiting. She had wrapped her scarf tightly, and a pair of leather gloves hid the bruises of sleepless nights. "I wanted to say thank you," she said, "for seeing her." Wimsey inclined his head. "She left us a map. It was simply a matter of learning to read it." She would have liked that, a pause. "The manuscript," she said, "the one she wrote, what will you do with it?" "Preserve it," said Wimsey, "possibly publish it, with a foreword, not as evidence but as art. She wanted it read. You can always tell." Lady Broxley looked toward the vicarage. "There's a room in the attic," she wrote in. "I'm having it cleaned. I thought I'd make it a little library." "A fine idea," said Wimsey. "Keep the ghosts among the shelves." They parted at the lane. Parker offered Wimsey a lift, but the detective refused. "I think I'll walk a little," he said. "Clear the dust from my shoes." He set off down the road with the long, lean stride of a man accustomed to distance, his coat flaring slightly. In the breeze, the brim of his hat dipping just low enough to obscure his expression. He walked past the chapel. He paused, and then he stepped through the ruins one last time. The bell rope had been removed, yes, but still he could see the marks, where it had hung. He walked the length of the nave, stopping at the spot where Lady Broxley had stood, where Barstow had confessed. The place still held a strange silence, not empty, but full of something unsaid. Wimsey removed his hat. "There's always a cost," he said aloud. "But I hope you knew. Someone was listening." Then he turned, and the shadows closed behind him. Above, a raven flapped from the belfry and vanished into the grey. The wind whispered, and the ashes beneath the hearthstone cooled, finally, into stillness. The letter came 3 weeks later, postmarked from Oxford, written in a graceful, slanted hand upon heavy cream stationery. Wimsey received it at Talboys, his country house in Hertfordshire, where the skies had recently begun to thaw into tentative blue, and the crocuses were making a brave, if shivering, appearance along the garden border. He opened the envelope beside a breakfast of lightly poached eggs and indifferent coffee under, the benign stare of a Gainsborough portrait that had, according to family legend, once winked during a séance. He read the letter once, then again. Then he set it down beside the toast rack and removed his spectacles, folding them with precise care. Harriet, who had been annotating a proof copy of The Moral Properties of the Sonnet, glanced up from the far end of the table. "News of consequence?" Wimsey smiled faintly. "Of resonance rather than consequence." She set her pen aside and waited. "It's from Miss Eliza Belcroft, former archivist, currently headmistress of St. Hester's Girls' Academy. She was a distant cousin to Margaret Hartley, our Miss Hartley. It appears she's been researching her cousin's disappearance since 1932. Harriet blinked. "That's remarkable." "Indeed," said Wimsey, "and quite moving. She writes that she had feared the worst for decades, but never expected resolution. She read about the Broxley case in the Morning Chronicle. Just a passing mention, but enough. She contacted the Home Office and was given my name, and now she writes to thank me." He slid the letter across the table. Harriet read in silence. "She was brilliant, you know. Quiet, yes, but keen as a tack. I think she might have become a playwright, had things been different. There was a time when she and her sister would perform scenes in the drawing room for our aunt's supper guests, dramas with mistaken identities and secret rooms and poisoned wine. Margaret always played the detective. Ironic, isn't it?" Wimsey refilled his coffee. Harriet's voice was soft. "Will she claim the body?" "Yes, a proper burial in their family plot in Paddington Green. She's arranging a small service. I've been invited, of course." "And will you go?" Wimsey smiled without teeth. "It seems only proper." The journey to London was uneventful, save for a delay outside Finchley, due to a sheep wandering onto the tracks. A fitting tribute, Wimsey thought, to the great British tradition of dignified inconvenience. He arrived in Paddington Green on a grey Wednesday morning. Beneath a drizzle so fine and persistent, it seemed to soak directly into the bones without troubling the coat. The cemetery was modest, the kind that required familiarity rather than grandeur to be beautiful. No sweeping arches, no obelisks, just lichen-covered headstones and crows. Eliza Belcroft was waiting at the gate. A woman in her 60s with steel-coloured hair arranged in a no-nonsense chignon. She wore a grey coat buttoned high and sensible shoes, the kind made for libraries and puddles alike. "Lord Peter," she said simply, "Miss Belcroft." They shook hands. "She lies there," Eliza said, pointing, "next to her sister." The grave was freshly dug, the stone not yet inscribed. A modest plaque rested at the base. Margaret Elaine Hartley, 1903-1932, beloved sister, remembered. No fanfare, no crowd, just the two of them and the drizzle and a silence not unlike peace. "I used to think," Eliza said, "that the worst thing was not knowing." But now that I know, I think perhaps the worst thing was how long no one else did. Wimsey said nothing. After a moment she continued. You read her work? I did, and so did others. She wrote to be understood, Eliza said. That's all she ever wanted. Wimsey looked down at the grave. She was. They stood there until the drizzle turned to mist, and the air felt like parchment left too long near the fire. Later that week, back at Talboys, Wimsey summoned his publisher. Anonymously, he insisted, the manuscript will appear as fiction, with an editor's note, no mention of the case. But why, the editor asked, perplexed. Because it deserves to be read for what it is, Wimsey said, not what it became. Let her be known not as the woman in the fireplace, but as the writer she nearly was. And so it was that, several months later, a small volume appeared under the title The Woman in the Bell Tower. It gained modest attention. A few literary reviewers praised its atmospheric intensity and its emotional restraint. One critic called it a minor Gothic masterpiece. Another dismissed it as melancholic and obscure. But a quiet few read it deeply. One reader, an undergraduate at Cambridge, was moved enough to adapt it for the stage. Another wrote a dissertation on grief in mid-century women's literature, dedicating it to the anonymous author, and in a second-hand bookshop in Islington, a woman browsing the shelves found it tucked between Wuthering Heights and the Moonstone. She bought it for £1 and cried at the final line, though she never quite knew why. Years passed. The rectory at Broxley remained. It was sold, eventually, to a retired professor of paleography who never quite managed to repair the West Wing. Tourists sometimes asked about the fire or the bones or the bell that rang by itself. No one ever gave them the full story, but in the attic the little library remained. A single chair, a shelf, a desk, and one framed page from the original manuscript, preserved under glass. It read, "They think the ashes cool, but the embers still know the shape of what burned." Wimsey visited once more many years later, older, slower, a cane now, though not with a brass tip. He stepped through the chapel ruins again, touched the edge of the hearthstone and sat briefly in the schoolroom where she had taught, and written, and waited. He did not speak aloud this time, but the silence again was not empty. It was simply full of listening. And so the story closed, not with revelation, but with recognition, not with justice alone, but with dignity restored. The ink remained.